present something else. We decided to change completely the format. Instead of presenting two classical conferences, one by myself and then followed one by Raphael Zagury-Orly, we decided to write up a dialogue, a written dialogue, which I hope will touch on the question of catastrophe. So here we go. One always thinks, speaks from a particular and singular point of view. I think we both agree that the view from nowhere is not ours, cannot be one to adopt for the finite historical subjects we all are. Now there would be much to say here on the possibility or impossibility of an objective viewpoint. But I believe we both agree that the pretension to a purely objective, universal viewpoint is always in some manner or another suspicious, problematic, insufficient. Not only because this pretension cannot account for its own justification, the source of its advent or rationale, but also since this viewpoint, this neutral point of view, cannot not extract, abstract itself from that which it pretends to see or cast a view on. That is, it cannot not always remove itself from the concrete, the effective, tangible reality it seeks to explicate whilst pretending to explicate it.
This is a powerful paradox which will ceaselessly haunt each one of our affirmations, both written and spoken, bringing us, each time we speak or write, ever so close to an abyss. That of not being able to speak or write at all, the abyss of silence. Silence is always the risk when speaking or writing. The risk cannot be escaped, nor should be evaded. We always are on the brink of silence, and that is a terrible paradox. The more objective a viewpoint pretends to be, the more it removes itself from the actual object. The more measured, impartial, reserved we are about the world, the less we situate ourselves in the world, the less we are exposed to the world. And thus, the less we can speak or write about the world, its history, its becoming, its past and its future, if a future it has to have. In this manner, yes, we are here at the crux of a paradox. We are seeking to speak and think our epoch, and yet the possibility of speaking and writing and thinking objectively about our epoch, on our epoch, is not at hand and failing us. Hölderlin said, the words are missing. Yes, in a certain manner, but for different reasons, the words are missing us, or we are missing the words, not because we are lacking explicative frameworks, but rather because of these explicative frameworks themselves. Because the words of these explicative frameworks, schemas, interpretations are not, or no longer, capable of meaning what we pretend they mean, or what we had pretended these to mean.
And yet, as a consequence of this paradox, we both agree, I think, that a purely subjective view is also not tenable. In this sense, we must add to this paradoxality. A subjective point of view on a given reality or situation is always and already devoid of any generality, and thus can hardly count as an interpretation claiming any meaningfulness. The more subjective a point of view becomes, the less it can claim to being a point of view at all. A point of view worth discussing, appraising, or evaluating. The paradoxality we are here speaking of is thus profoundly troubling. Neither an objective view nor a simplistic subjective feeling can serve as our possible discourse. Hence the question, where does one stand when one risks the act of speaking, of writing, on or about a given situation, an epoch, a historical being in the world?
It remains philosophically impossible to situate clearly and distinctly when, and even how this paradoxality affecting both our speech and our writing, affecting our thinking, inscribed itself in our consciousness, in our culture, in our civilization. Of course, in the history of thought, there have always been skeptics. However, we are here elaborating a skeptical analysis which goes beyond what the traditional skeptics, and firstly Greek, formulated. Our skepticism is also exercised towards the Cartesian method of radical doubt. Our skepticism is one of passivity, is one of a form of weakness, which never arms itself with any power, any faculty, any capacity. It adopts a language of showing, a language of exposition, of exhibition. It is a skepticism of monstration, of demonstration. We could call it a pictorial skepticism. Nietzsche would have said a skepticism of weariness, of exhaustion, which wears down and exhausts even the possibility to call this skepticism a skepticism. This is why ultimately the word of skepticism is not entirely appropriate because, and to take here Nietzsche's lead, the weariness and exhaustion affects every word, every concept, every idea capable of grasping our situation.
Yes, you're speaking of skepticism, but there's also a clear link with the idea of crisis.
Yes, right. Today, we often have recourse to the term crisis in order to describe our present situation. We speak of economical crisis, crisis of identity, crisis of culture, of education. We speak often of the crisis of lodging, crisis of politics, etc. What is meant in these expressions? And what do we understand by the word crisis? The word crisis comes from the Greek word kinein. It means to separate, to cut apart, to isolate, to differentiate, and thus, by extension, to discern, to analyze, and thus, to judge. And we all know it is at the origin of what we have come to know under the word critique, criticism, critical theory, critical analysis. The word also arises in the medical lexicon. Crisis defines the turning point, the critical point in the evolution of a sickness. It thus means the moment where the patient can either heal or get sicker. We know also it is a juridical term, which marks the decisive moment of a judgment. In philosophy, however, the term crisis is linked to the extent and deployment of rationality. It accompanies the history of reason. In Kant, the term crisis forms a direct link to that of critique. That is, the moment where the subject can pose the question by which it becomes possible for this subject to know, to act, to judge. Hegel defined crisis as the source and the need of meaning, of signification, of philosophy, and thus as the process by which, through negativity, is revealed a grasp, a comprehension, a reappropriation, and thus a possibility to surpass and relieve us from the crisis. Crisis in Hegel is already the sign of its overcoming in the manifestation of a new and higher figure of meaning.
Yes, the history of philosophy always and already understands crisis from the possibility of relieving us from it, from the possibility of elevating us beyond the critical moment. But I think you would agree with me here that we ought to pose the question, are we today in an epoch of crisis? Is our epoch one of crisis? Of yet another crisis in the long history of crises, which have all been relieved, which have all been signs of better times to come, which have always served as an annunciation of some sort of salvation. Can we today, in order to assess our situation, have recourse to the term of crisis? Can we, in the face of what we are living today, mobilize a possible resolution of this crisis? Can we today still conceive of our crisis as a resource and ultimately as that which marks the possibility of overcoming our crisis? Or are we forced to admit that the very possibility of relieving us from crisis, of overcoming crisis, of resolving our crisis, is today unambiguously impossible on us? This impossibility to overcome our crisis by the traditional manners we have always mobilized in order to surmount critical moments or epochs in our history would mean that we find ourselves not in a new epoch, but rather that we have grasped more profoundly our human condition in history, in its history. We have grasped what it means for man to be an actor in and within history. This is an important point, I believe. We are not saying that we pass from one epoch to another, from an epoch of meaning to an epoch of the exhaustion of meaning. Rather, we're saying that the very logic of marking, of labeling, of positioning, of differentiating epochs is here undermined, voided, emptied out through and by a deeper grasp of our historical situation. A historical situation which is not limited, circumscribed, or bounded to an epoch or to a logic of epochality.
Yes. We are here in a situation where the very possibility of locating and distinguishing epochs has fallen out of grace, so to speak. For us today, but perhaps this has always been the case, to speak of a former historical epoch and a contemporary epoch, to state, for example, that at this epoch, man acquired universal human rights, or stepped out of religious superstition and into an epoch of secularization, is simply put impossible. A certain feeling of ridicule pervades, or ought to pervade, in this manner of describing, analyzing our historical situation. To speak or think today, like Hegel yesterday, of separate, different moments of history is in many ways passé. In a certain manner, at least, ridiculous for us today. A certain ridicule accompanies such descriptions. I'm not saying that this manner of cutting up or sectioning history is utterly nonsensical. Rather, we are saying that its rationality, the meaning it describes in the becoming of history, is profoundly misleading, a construction imposed on a becoming which perhaps remains devoid of any such rational development. Idem for the idea we constantly call onto when thinking history of a turn, a shift, or a historical change or mutation. These words retain and emanate from an anthropocentric logic, an intentional rationale which begins with the pretension of the subject to state its situation in history, which proceeds by putting forth an intentionality which is comprehensible by the subject and always returns to that which is subject. This subject could grasp and understand. It is history made understandable by the subject. But from where does this claim arise? From which law or place does this particular manner of appropriating history, our history, deploy itself? What is its fundamental justification? Is history only that which the subject can appropriate? Or is there in history something which does not entirely fit in the framework of the subject's understanding?
Yeah, I think we should here intend to formulate thus a certain type of nihilism, which is not convertible, transformable into a crisis. We seek here to complicate in this manner this paradox, to complicate our understanding of history as crisis, which presupposes the unshakable idea of a subject capable of transforming history into a rational development of meaning. It is thus towards a complication of the entire structure of donation, which needs here to be questioned and thus demystified. The entire idea of donation needs and requires here to be rethought, that is also deconstructed, projected out of itself, out of its own most logic. What needs and requires to be thus rethought, re-examined, deconstructed, is the very idea that history is the theater of that which has already occurred. that the meaning of history has already been given to us almost before any singular historical events. In the sense, what we are questioning is the structure that would see in what occurs historically what has already occurred in history. That the events which mark our history have always and already been signified in a meaningful manner as history, and consequently that we are but on the receiving end of a packaged, almost pre-packaged meaning for our historical events. What we need to question here is the curious manner in which we clear our consciousness, pretend to have a good, calm, pacified consciousness, and by it negate the historical events themselves, negate history itself.
But does this mean that there is no hegemonic world order, no law of history, no rationale for history? Does this mean to state that there is no structure to history? Certainly, there is always a necessity to think history. Our history, as it is shaped and defined through globalization, technology, telecommunication, etc. But also, and at the same time, our thinking of history requires us to reflect outside and beyond these manners of circumscribing history to the development of a directive and directed orientation. In this sense, we are not seeking to oppose to the great metaphysics of history, ancient or contemporary, a certain ahistoricity. Nor are we seeking to oppose to these conceptions of history as a simple series of circumstantial or coincidental events. We are not seeking to step outside history, its circumscribed meaning, its orientation, the manner in which we inherit history, as if this was at all possible or even desirable. We are not seeking thus to simply oppose, reverse, question one determination of history with another. Let's call it here a post-metaphysical thinking of history, one where there would be no such and no possible determination of history. Rather, we are seeking to think without the oppositional, reversing, substituting logic, which, as we know, has always reduced the historicity of history. In this sense, what we seek to escape, what we are in a certain manner tired of, is the manner in which the great philosophical teleologies of history neutralize, annul, lock up and close up the historicity of history by comprehending it through a conceptualization of history.
Yeah, here there's a shift. Not a shift which would mark an epoch, a passage, a change in orientation. You are here now, you are there, etc. A shift in the sense of a certain recognition, a certain revelation that to think history, our history, without the entire structure of onto-theological determination of history, is to confront thinking to nihilism. First point, thus, nihilism has always worked through, pervaded, permeated, transpired in our thinking, in our history. Nietzsche said, nihilism is ecstasy. What could this phrase mean? It means for Nietzsche that nihilism incessantly transforms, converts what is meant into its other, into its contrary. As if nihilism forced the self to come out of itself and embody the other than the self. In a sense, what Nietzsche means is that each word says the other of what it words. Each affirmation is always other than what it wants or seeks to affirm. Take the rationalist, for example. He's always in some way caught up by his own irrationality. Or the atheist. He's always in some manner caught up by some sort of theism, working deeply in his so-called affirmed and claimed atheism.
So what could be understood as nihilism? Now, of course, this word is constantly misused today. In common language, we say nihilist of someone who claims not to have any norms or values, who believes in nothing. But that's common language. we call nihilism a simple lack of values or norms, as if these just disappeared or evaporated into thin air. But of course, nihilism is wholly and utterly contrary to this simplistic and everyday definition. Nihilism means the progressive and inevitable erosion of values and norms in and within their affirmation, assertion, positing. We could even risk a phrase which could be heard as shocking, but which nonetheless translates precisely what is nihilism. Nihilism is the affirmation of norms, is the assertion of values, is the position, the positing of an inflexible and static hierarchy of values and norms. How? Because norms and values, their affirmation, assertion, positing is also at the same time their voiding and their exhaustion. This is why nihilism is the dark side of what is affirmed, the other of what is said or claimed, the negation of what is asserted. Nietzsche was categorical here. Nihilism is always the transvaluation of values at the moment of their assertion. Each time we say, I am just. Each time we say, I am giving, loving, true, generous. And we are here, of course, concentrating on the so-called positive values. It would be too simple to focus on the contrary values, unjust, meager, hating, false. We are here. Each time we say, I am just, we are affirming a ground, a foundation, and also a hierarchy. And at the same time, lurks the question, who are we to establish so certainly and distinctly a ground, a foundation, a hierarchy for such noble ideas? Who are we and what is our justification? In other words, lurks the question, what is the ground of what I take to be the ground? What is the foundation on which I say, this is a foundation? After all, who can or may say, I am just? I know I am right. I know who is wrong.
Here's the question which we could link immediately. Is not thinking requiring, obliging, calling us to leave this propositional, ontological act, that of stating and affirming, I am such and such, I am so and so, I know I am this and this, etc. And the same question, or close to the same question, another question, let's say in the same vein, can be had of history and of our speaking, writing about history. Is not thinking, speaking, writing on history require us to leave the possibility of reading it as the development of crises, which inevitably leads us to think history in and within the horizon of an apocalyptic moment, that of the revelation of the meaning of history. We know that the word apocalypse comes from apokalyptein, which is of course made up of the Greek word kalyptein, the hidden, the concealed, the secret, and the privative prefix apo. Apokalyptein is the breaking moment, the rupture. That is also the opening where the hidden, the concealed, the secret is revealed, is brought out into the open, into the seen, into the visible, or the manifest. This means, in truth, the manner in which we have thought, spoken, written on history, on our history, as the proliferation of crises, of moments of crises to be overcome and surpassed, has always been but a secularization of a profoundly religious theme, that of the apocalypse, where the hidden meaning of history is suddenly revealed, brought out into the open, the clear, the seen.
And what is this meaning? That catastrophe is always and already a simulacra of catastrophe. Have we ever thought what a catastrophe is? What it could be? What it would mean? That is, what a catastrophe signifies by thinking it without reducing it to a crisis, in framing it within the apocalyptic horizon of history, without thus implying an invasion out of the violence of history and its overcoming, its pacification, its reconciliation. In a certain sense, that we are expecting here in thinking history is to step out of the logic by which catastrophe is transvaluated, transformed, turned around to mean an overcoming of its catastrophic event in its being reduced to an apocalyptic moment of truth. What happens here? What happens is a leveling out, a neutralization, a flattening out of justice, of these questions pertaining to justice and which are situated beyond the system of right, the so-called system of justice, beyond the legitimation of a judgment capable of setting out what is right and what is wrong, thereby reducing justice to simple justification. In the immense and embracing lucidity of forgiveness. The affair of catastrophe is to pose questions in regards to this immense and powerful logic of forgiveness, that is, of this movement by which forgiveness relieves, retrieves, reconciles beyond catastrophe. Hence, to also pose questions in regards to the immense and powerful logic working within forgiveness of sacrifice, of the sacrifice of the self or of the other, of the self and of the other in the proliferation of a pacified, reconciled historical becoming. The affair of catastrophe is to pose impossible questions of justice. That we will have here to see how these questions of justice are impossible whilst also being positive, purposeful, decisive, how they bring about not only a voiding of this immense and powerful movement of reading history as the continuous line evolving from crisis to crisis, from crisis to forgiveness, from sacrifice to justificatory evolution, to endless rituals of commemoration. Also, this immense line thus of forgiveness, of sacrifice, of what is sacrificed for forgiveness and what forgiveness sacrifices. As if nothing ought never to appear or reappear on the ruins of catastrophe. Neither man, God, history, world, etc., etc. Nothing which is or nothing which resolves itself in a necessity. Nothing necessary. That is, nothing which is able to raise or undo the veil on the end of history. An end which would also be its beginning point, its source, its dawn. What we are saying is extremely hard, cold, rigid, because what we are questioning, seeking here to deconstruct, to dismantle, is precisely that which can or does offer a consolation. And in our time of nihilism, a nihilism in which all values, all professed, confessed values are incessantly transformed, affirm and mean the contrary of what they seemingly assert, at a time when we are at loss of any assurance and where our institutions are always claiming the contrary of what they are perpetrating, we naturally seek consolation. But we must also reserve ourselves the justice to pose questions to the hidden motives and concealed strategies of consolation, of compassion, of pity.
One word on these strategies of consolation, compassion, and pity. One word also on the notion of necessity. The necessity of such modalities which adopt the form or the envelope of protection. Consolation, compassion, pity are forms of protection, as are institutions, state institutions, and law-forming foundations. And these are obviously absolutely necessary. They are necessary for ourselves, for our community, for our being together. They are necessary in that they protect from the radical violence of indifference, and thus protect us from economical, political, societal, even natural precariousness. The state, through its institutions, ought to always intervene when catastrophe hits or when crises occur in order to protect us from the risk of our disappearance. And of course, the state and its institutions are even founded on a violence of right, which measures and circumscribes the violence of catastrophe. It is not here the place, and we would not be able to, nor would we wish to stand against the necessity of protecting ourselves. In other words, it is not the case here for us to deny or stand against the protection which comes from the assurance offered by the different protective modalities. Take Hegel's concept of right. Remember what Hegel stated about the necessary violence of right to protect us from the worst and absolute violence of indifference, where there is no possibility to distinguish between the self and the other, and thus where there is simply a pure and immediate void, where all meaning, all ethical meaning is annulled. There is thus a necessity for our institutions and the protection they offer us, a necessity for a certain type of measured and circumscribed violence. There is always the necessity to protect ourselves from death, from madness, from violence, which are already there, present, necessary, that we cannot deny nor negate, simply pass over, and of which we must at times, sometimes confront their possibility and necessity. We must subscribe to insurance policies. Insurances are necessary. Car insurance, life insurance, damages and risks insurance, insurance against all types of catastrophes. And we always do assure ourselves against risks, crises, catastrophes of all kinds, which could affect life, our everydayness. However, someone who always requires insurances, who subscribes to all kinds of insurances, who constructs his space through assurances and protecting insurances, someone who would wish to enclose his space by insurances and assurances would be in a delirium as grave as one who would not subscribe to any insurance at all. Hence, our choice is always between at least two deliriums. The delirium of insurances and assurances everywhere and against everything, and the delirium of having no insurance and no assurances anywhere.
So despite this necessity of protection, guarded and safeguarded by our institutions, political institutions, necessity of protection which is incessantly and justifiably so redefined, perfected, re-elaborated, critically questioned, the questions we are posing, the questions of justice, stem from an entirely other, a wholly other source. They emanate from the worst, from the disaster, from the absolute risk of losing everything and everyone. They emanate for an entirely other impulse than that proclaiming the necessity of protection. They come, these questions of justice, not from the circumscribable space of reason, insurance, assurance, norms, values, not from the space of reason which circumscribes violence. They come, these questions of justice, from an entirely exposed nudity to that which is unpacified, unthinkable even by the space of reason, by insurance, norm, value. An exposed nudity where what is questioned is not how to circumscribe violence, but rather why the circumscription of violence is always and already carrying something else, another agenda than what it is pretending to carry or bring forth. A certain experience of the loss of assurances, of the absence of norms, of values, program, agenda is necessary for the possibility of thinking. And of thinking what is meant, what is wished, what is desired, what is strategic also in these assurances, these norms, values, programs, agendas. More than once I have thought that to deliver oneself entirely to the possibility of the concept, of the faculty of anticipating everything, programming what is coming, appears, occurs, was just as dangerous, as perilous, as hazardous as to deliver oneself to the complete absence of the concept.
Our question could be formulated around the development of the classical idea of humanism. And in regards to what we are assisting today, the advent of a movement which is not at all contradictory to the classical 17th and 18th century idea of humanism, that of post-humanism or transhumanism. We know and can see today that this movement of post-humanism or transhumanism is both and at the same time a recuperation, a reformulation, and a surpassing or an overcoming of the classical idea of man. Firstly, a retrieval, in that it embodies the very desire and directing, orienting, leading idea proper to man, that of perfectibility and universality, of becoming a perfect identity, and that all men are universally recognizable, comprehensible. This retrieval is, however, also a surpassing or overcoming of the idea of man, in that it does away, it negates, it erases all and every difference, singularity, ownness to man. It seeks to surpass the finitude of man in the pretension to eliminate from the identity of man those events which mark its finitude.
Posthumanism is thus a radical reformulation, recuperation, and surpassing of humanism. The questions need here to be addressed towards this movement of recuperation and surpassing. What is the effect of this technological inframing of the idea of humanism, of the figure of the human beyond its finitude and its singularity? It must be noted that the radicality here is that posthumanism indeed determines, controls, regulates, adjusts the idea of the human to the bluntly immediate, simple-minded actuality of the human. Posthumanism, in this sense, is the accomplishment of the classical idea of humanism, in that it seeks to embody all the universalist values attributed to the human, universalist values as transparency and immortality. Posthumanism means thus to reformulate in a strictly monolithic, monolinguistic, flat, perfectly transparent manner at once the past, the present, and the future of the human. And indeed, posthumanism takes on the task of bringing and elevating the finitude of the human, all its finitudes, the demultiplied indeterminacy working through the human, to a perfectly comprehended, self-identical, immortal, and infinite concrete human. In a certain manner, posthumanism marks a human without birth, without death, without language. By removing from these, at least these, any sign of finitude and of that which could remain undetermined in and within the human. The post-human is here only determined by perfectibility. And in this sense, posthumanism forgets, negates, silences the human itself. That is, its multiple sources, the differentiated origins, the non-universalizable identities working through each singular man. It brings to a status of uniformity which cuts through the chance proper to the human in each and singular human. That is, the chance of the untranslatable, irreducible, unappropriable singularities in each human, in order to actualize the wish, the requirement to embody a common, interchangeable, similar figure of humanity. Posthumanism is thus a curious retrieval and surpassing of humanism. It forgets the indetermination, the origin without origin, always multiple, always undeterminable singularity of the human identity.
So we can at least name three of these singularities, you've named them, that posthumanism seeks to surpass and overcome in the effort to a perfect humanity. Natality, language, and death. So natality is awkward. It arises out of the chance meeting of two individuals who procreate, and in their procreation bring into the world a being who is entirely unassured, without insurance, wholly exposed to all kinds of risk. Notice thus, however, the profound ethical idea directing this pretension to secure, to ensure, to assure that the product of procreation is not exposed to any risk any risk factor, and some that it remains protected from being exposed. And thus, post-humanists seek to develop a scientific, technological assurance that the product will be fit, not have any singularity which could expose it to the risk of sickness, of malformation, of disease. In sum, the desire here is to rid all natality from the imperfections of singularity and of the hazard proper to the singular event of natality. And so we are beginning to calculate, to measure, to control natality, and succeeding in producing beings which are risk-free, and thus who are, in all matters considered, as perfect as they can be.
Language is also a troubling sign of finitude. We all have different languages. We all speak different words, even when these are the same. What I see, perceive, feel, remember, think, recall, when I use a particular word, is wholly and entirely different from what someone else sees, perceives, feels, remembers, thinks, recalls in the same word. Certainly we find a common ground. We understand vaguely a certain sameness in the words we use, and this understanding is conventional. But fundamentally, there is always and already something wholly mysterious when two or three or a group of people speak to each other and manage to understand themselves. Because fundamentally we all have our own language, our own singular language. Well, the posthumanists seek to resolve this ambiguity and put an end to this mystery by assuring and ensuring that language is perfectly understandable and immediately recognizable by all. In other words, that the fantasy of pure transparency is once and for all delivered. What one says is exactly and perfectly understood by the other, and thus we will finally reach the idea of a universalized analytical language. The price, however, is the radical negation and reduction of the singularity of our private, wholly individual languages. The gain will be universal communication, the assurance and insurance of having between men no ambiguity, no vagueness, no problems, no breakdowns of communication. Again, this is an inspired humanist idea, the aspiration of a universalized language where all our propositions are meaningful to all. But does this not also mean the reduction, the destruction of language itself, and moreover, of the very condition of language? We don't speak to each other because we understand each other. On the contrary, in a certain manner, we speak to each other because and since there is a radical and profound impossibility to understand each other.
And death. Death is most certainly the one event which post-humanists or transhumanists target and seek to resolve. To resolve and surpass the imminent event of death, to overcome the inherent finitude of human existence, to do away with our being towards death. Such is one of the major tasks of the post-humanist and transhumanist movement. Why? Because death represents one of the most individualizing and unsubstitutable event of human finitude, and thus of human singularity. Death is the very event marking, signifying, denoting the inherent finitude of human existence. Heidegger, of course, typified this event at the heart of human existence in its most radical formulation. The event of death, as we know, is analyzed in being and time as that which is at once the most certain knowledge of the human condition, whilst being the most unknown event in this very condition.
We can claim here at once, and before we go deeper into this paradoxality, this ambiguity, this double play between known and the unknown, all brought into one event, that of death, claim thus that the unknown is precisely that to which all thinking, all thought must confront itself in order to begin its work. A thought which only thinks the known, a thought which only thinks the known, which only rolls out the possible, which only executes itself in the realm of the possibly known, is simply said, instrumental, economical, managerial. In one word, it is a thinking which does not elevate itself outside design. This is an important point. It means to mark that thinking, the act of thinking, requires its constant and incessant confrontation. We ought even to say polemos, towards the unthinkable, the unknowable, the irrepresentable, the radical other than design. If thinking settles for the thinkable, settles for the organization of the knowable, the management of the representable, the production of that which is designable, then, well, it is not thinking. It is the simple economical operation of making things work, according to a logic which never confronts the multiple concreteness of events in history. In truth, to organize thinking by invoking, for example, that thinking must be adjusted to a principle of reality we ought never think outside of, is to deliberately reduce the act of thinking to a simple managerial operation, as if thinking was simply the systematic, obvious, straightforward application of a predisposed and predetermined design-like concept on anything and everything, on any event and every catastrophe.
So I have one question. Is this thinking art?
So, I think what I was saying is that a thought which only thinks the known, which only rolls out the possible, which only executes itself in the realm of the possibly known, is simply said instrumental, economical, managerial. In one word, it is a thinking which does not elevate itself outside design. This is an important point. It means to mark that thinking, the act of thinking, requires its constant and incessant confrontation. We ought even to say polemos, towards the unthinkable, the unknowable, the irrepresentable, the radical other design. If thinking settles for the thinkable, settles for the organization of the knowable, the management of the representable, the production of that which is designable, then, well, it is not thinking. It is the simple economical operation of making things work, according to a logic which never confronts the multiple concreteness of events in history. In truth, to organize thinking by invoking, for example, that thinking must be adjusted to a principle of reality. This is something we all heard a lot in Bezalel during the last few weeks, that thinking must be adjusted to a principle of reality. A principle of reality we ought never think outside of is to deliberately reduce the act of thinking to a simple managerial operation. As if thinking was simply the systematic, obvious, straightforward application of a predisposed and predetermined design-like concept on anything and everything, on any event and every catastrophe.
So I want here to relate this again to the question of catastrophe. The catastrophe, in truth, is to reduce thinking to such an operation, to such an operative agenda. It is not only a catastrophe because it negates at its source the possibility of invention. It is the catastrophe because we are operating as if the history of our historical catastrophes, the First World War, the Shoah, Chernobyl, Fukushima, to name here but a few, radically different from one another, obviously, operating as if the history of our historical catastrophes were all emanating from a sameness, to which a same response founded on a self-asserted capacity, faculty, power would remain adequate. We are operating here in the circle of the same, despite the radical differences and singularities of the catastrophes of our history and those to come. This is the catastrophe, the reduction of thinking to the application of a same logic to whatever is occurring and affecting human existence. The catastrophe is that things continue as they always have, and according to the pretension that events are always and already the same. What we are here seeking is to rethink thinking itself, and thus to inscribe in thinking a type of revolt against the reductive operation of thinking, which endlessly symbolizes the sameness of all events and the sameness of all responses to any or every event. We seek here a type of redefinition of thinking beyond the hegemony which sees in thinking the proliferation of the same schema to apply to all and every event. In the sense, we seek to think a thinking which always and already thinks beyond itself, exceeds its pretension to the same, to the universality of all that happens to it, and thus a thinking which remains exposed to the unsubstitutable singularity of the events it is confronted to. A certain type of radical singularity of thinking, expecting thinking to always and already exceed itself beyond its economical, design-like concept application.
In many ways, and even if we're not situating the redefinition of thinking in the classical opposition between realism and idealism, what we are seeking is something like an otherwise than the real and not yet the ideal, or otherwise than the ideal and not yet the real. A thinking which does not confine itself nor reduce itself to a principle of reality, nor to a principle of ideality, but which always and already commands, expects, demands of thinking the impossible. The impossible for both the real and the ideal. This means an incessant reworking of the real and the ideal, a perpetual effort of disturbing and hence of awakening both the real and the ideal to another diction. We are seeking to force the real and the ideal to formulate themselves otherwise. Why do we insist here? Why do we insist here on the impossible? Why this insistence on the impossible, an insistence which is so difficult to hear? And this insistence will remain ever so difficult, perhaps even impossible for us to hear. Why? Because it demands and commands us to entirely re-question, re-examine, re-elaborate the central notion of human faculty, of what we call a faculty. This insistence on the impossible is not understandable as a norm, as a normative commandment for an autonomous, deliberate, deciding subject. It undermines the very possibility of norming, of postulating values, or of elaborating value judgments, since it undermines what we call naively a principle of reality, as well as disturbs the equally naive principle of ideality, whilst remaining incessantly obsessed by these. The impossible requires, in this sense, more than a redefinition of the real and of the ideal. It expects something like the confrontation to what the real and the ideal cannot contain, but which at the same time forces the real and the ideal to access themselves beyond what they are, beyond what they signify, beyond what they mean. The impossible requires the real and the ideal outside themselves to the point unexpected and unnormed, where they begin to signify other performatives than the ones they represent. As if a certain incessant supplementarity was to be inscribed within the real and the ideal. A supplementarity not finding its source in the possible, nor in the possibility of the real or the ideal, to assume and assure their own signification or self-identity.
Another word on the otherwise than the real, not yet ideal, or otherwise than the ideal, not yet the real. This formula, which is another manner of marking the impossible, perhaps it will be, perhaps in the future it will be named otherwise. This formula, perhaps we will phrase it in the future otherwise. Perhaps one day we will give it other names than the impossible. Perhaps not one day, but not yet. Not yet here does not mean to claim a teleological horizon by which what occurs is always and already signified or known. Not yet here opens to the perhaps. To this perhaps one day in another language, perhaps the language of art, these words are named, said, pronounced otherwise. Perhaps these words already express themselves otherwise in another language, within our own languages. Perhaps already, here and now, figures without a resolute overcoming or surpassing, without a possible comprehension, more exposed figures, figures more awakened than ever to exposition are drawn. These figures today may seem only negative. They conceal in truth a powerful positivity. A positivity so positive, it has yet to be expressed fully, entirely, completely in the logic which is ours today. And perhaps it cannot be unambiguously expressed. Perhaps it requires another logic altogether.
But what we must retain today, at least, is that if there is anything expressed in whatever way, it is always stemming, arriving from this other language in our languages. Another language which incessantly speaks through our languages. Another language which renders impossible its communicative translation, whilst incessantly opening to the very possibility in our languages to express anything at all. If in a certain manner art, in its utmost and inherent complexity, ambiguity, fragility, incomprehensibility, impossibility for it to accord itself to the used-up, dominant schemas of our epoch, if in a certain manner art opposes, resists stubbornly, stands against the prevailing and domineering structures, logic, dictates of communication, utility, instrumentality, it is at once to promise their future, to promise the possibility for these to express themselves otherwise than how they present themselves today, and to keep them, to guard them from their being worn out, from their usury or attrition. And more than this, it is also and mostly to situate thinking in a wholly other place within the common flat-leveled space. It is in art, it is in and through this tension, in and through the incessant endurance of this tension without resolution, that we could, if there is such a thing, think the responsibility for us as artists. Responsibility to always exceed what is dictated by our epoch, responsibility to not settle for the possible, responsibility towards a future which does not yet say its name. Thank you.